Hello, this is part two of the recorded lecture on race. Uh, for this lecture, which is going to be posted for all my classes, partly because the version posted in the social problems um, and my online intro to sociology course has a problem with the sound. Additionally, it was recorded a few months ago. Um, Sadly, not much has changed. Uh, there's been more incidents of the same unfortunate, which is a euphemism that really shouldn't be used, brutal actions on the part of institutional actors have continued. In any case, this is primarily going to focus on what is in the PDF of the PowerPoint presentation that I'm about to go through, because the questions on the exam are answered within this PDF. I'm going to be adding a lot of information that will not be on the exam. I hope it will be of some interest. This is part two. I'm just going to be it's going to be pretty straightforward, just going through the concepts and definitions, etc., examples in the PDF of the PowerPoint presentation that's been prepared and modified over time. So, race. What is race? Well, basically, we're going to talk about the social construction of race. And if you have viewed the film, Race, the Power of an Illusion, Part 1, which is the subject of writing assignments for some of my classes, if required assignments in some, extra credit in others, you understand what social construction of race is about. You have seen how the differences between us are literally skin deep. The physical differences, which are historically, classically claimed to reflect distinct races, really just reflect where your ancestors, what part of the world your ancestors lived in, and the group in which genes were exchanged over time. There have been race typically is just it's simply a way of putting individuals into categories, of drawing boundaries between groups, usually with the intent of privileging a dominant group by making a distinction between those who deserve more resources, more power, and those who do not deserve more resources, power, etc. Where the resources could be material or symbolic. They could be material, like the right to a job, or the ability to get a job, the ability to get an education, the nature of your economic arrangements with the people who employ you. Or it can be, as I said, symbolic. The right to vote, for instance, is a big one. We're really still in an election. It is not clear yet, one day after the official election day, who will be the president. One of the individuals has used race and what are called dog whistles, uh, code words that are recognized by those who choose to use race as a means of protecting their own privilege and disadvantaging others in a systematic way. In some that may be going many of them don't realize they're protecting their own privilege, perhaps. Many of the people who've supported one of our candidates, who surprisingly won an election 4 years ago, have legitimate grievances and resentments about the way the world has, the way history has played out for them. They had expectations of getting the same things, the same level of income, the same level of achievement of what you might call the American dream. And as a result of economic and historical political changes that were beyond their control, things changed. And often people find a scapegoat. They look for someone to blame, a person, something that's not abstract, like economic history, globalization, or whatever. They end up blaming the other victims of the same system. Um, and when people take these shortcuts and stereotype and categorize people and lay blame on scapegoats and what you might call pariah classes as well, um, that can play into the hands of individuals who are seeking power, political power. And we've seen how that works for a few years now. If you are a supporter of the president I'm speaking, I don't mean to disrespect you or your views. You are entitled to that. As I said, I believe, I understand people have legitimate complaints. Their lives have gotten worse. We see this in the so-called deaths of despair. The fact that life expectancy continues to increase in every advanced and developing economy in the world, with one exception, the United States. And the reason life expectancy is falling is a very high rate of what a couple of sociologists have called deaths of despair, suicide, death from liver failure as a result of excessive consumption of alcohol, opioid overdoses. And this is concentrated primarily in middle-aged white Americans without college degrees, which, if you've been following politics, you know that that constitutes the base of support for our current president. So, well, it's not the only part of the base, of course, but it's a big section of it, something that he could not afford to lose. So, as I said, I think they have legitimate resentments and grievances, but someone has chosen to explain the problem in a way that creates scapegoats and enhances the political power of certain political actors. And you see this happening around the world. It's happened throughout history. It's people can be conned. They can be misled. You tend to look for simple explanations, things that will fit on the, I don't mean to be flippant, the back of a cereal box, for instance. You don't have to read too much to figure out what's causing all your problems. So, race, socially constructed. There's really no clear-cut biological difference between races, certainly not at the level of genetics. We're pretty much all the same. We share most of the same genes. Now, there are some identifiable physical differences that form the basis for what has been called a race in modern society. In the ancient world, Greece, Rome, etc., race really just meant country, what part of the world you were from. You didn't necessarily look any different than those of other races, so-called. Race is also, in the contemporary world and in the past 200 years, has been connected with the institution of slavery, which I talked about in part 1 of this lecture. So we'll touch on that here and there. But again, in the ancient world, slavery was not the same type of system that existed in the antebellum, meaning prior to the war, the Civil War, or war between the states, whatever one wishes to call it, in the United States between 1860 and 1865. That system of slavery was one in which there were, granted, there were slave markets in the ancient world and in the Middle Ages and so forth, but slaves tended to be individuals who were captured in a war, for instance. When a Greek city defeated another Greek city, or a Persian army defeated a Greek city, they might, for instance, kill all of the male inhabitants and take the women and children with them to work as slaves in the home country. Slavery was it's been more common in human history than not. It has existed in some form most of our history. It was not uncommon for slaves to be freed. Also, in the ancient world, in the Middle Ages, slaves might have very responsible functions, secretaries or teachers, scribes of some sort, for powerful people. Uh, and quite, as I said, quite often they might be freed upon, for instance, the death of the owner, master, whatever they may have been called in the particular culture. In the American South, by the time of the Civil War, freeing a slave was illegal. If you were African American, well, African Americans, and there were no African Americans in the South, strictly speaking. They were not considered Americans. They were not citizens. They were bound to labor. They were in bondage. But if you were of African descent and had dark skin, you might well live freely in the North, in Massachusetts, for instance, and you own property, be able to vote in some states. But if you were to travel to Texas in 1859, you would most likely be seized and held in bondage, forced to work on a cotton plantation or rice plantation. There was no such thing as a free black in pre-war Texas, and eventually the entire group of states that seceded from the Union, which precipitated the Civil War, that became known as the Confederate States of America. You will hear, when people here locally and elsewhere defend the keeping monuments to the leaders of the Confederate Army, the Confederate heroes. I believe, I can't say for certain, I worked for the state of Texas in the year 2000 through 2002, the Environmental Regulatory Agency. And at that time, there was still an optional holiday called Confederate Heroes Day. Clearly, you don't find such holidays in the North. I believe it was Robert E. Lee's birthday or something like that. Robert E. Lee was the top Confederate general. I don't want to belabor that more than to add that you will hear people say it's a matter of protecting our heritage and honoring these people who fought for the Southern way of life against the brutal North, which was trying to force their industrial system upon our agricultural, gentlemanly, polite culture. And that it was not about slavery, it was about Northern aggression. You only have to read the declarations of secession that were passed by the various legislatures to see quite clearly they seceded to protect the institution of slavery because their economy was based solely on bonded labor. Okay, not solely, but primarily. Cotton was a major export to Britain. The Industrial Revolution itself really was about textiles, about taking cotton and making textiles and perhaps clothing out of it, or selling the textiles to people in India, another part of the British Empire, to be turned into clothing and re-imported to England. So just the Industrial Revolution, which we attribute as like catapulting us into the modern age, was intimately tied with slavery. Many economists and historians don't go quite that far, and I'm oversimplifying, but you can't really cleanly separate slavery and the Industrial Revolution. So, I believe I have strayed here from what I was attempting to do, but in any case, physical differences have been used, as I said, as a basis for putting people into categories of people which have fewer of some resource than others, less access, if any access at all, to these resources than the dominant group or those that are allied with the dominant group. For instance, in the South, you had less affluent whites. You had a planter aristocracy that lived very well. If you've traveled between Baton Rouge and New Orleans along the Mississippi, you've perhaps seen the 400 plantation houses along the river. Some are open for tours. I've never been down there really, so I'm not that interested. But in any case, race is something constructed. Well, who constructs it? According to Omi and Wacant, writing in 1994, developing their theory of racial group formation, they claim that it is governments, institutions, as well as individuals that are creating races, that are constructing the race. Okay. This construction is based upon a belief in some genetic basis for these differences. And again, there is some genetic basis, but it's nothing, it's a variant that these genes that vary, there's more genetic difference within races than there are between them. That may be a hard concept to grasp, but you just think about eye color. In every race, you look at people as a whole, you find all eye colors, okay? You look at a particular racial community and you might, well, I'll save that for later. You've seen the film, so you know how this works. It is kind of a hard, difficult concept to grasp, and I've forgotten how it plays out myself, which is why I'm stopping. I do forget things from time to time. I do have a biology degree, but I don't practice biology that much. So that claim puzzled me at the time. It's been around since the 60s. Richard Lewontin, a prominent geneticist, established that fact, that the differences within groups, just between white individuals, for instance, the range of difference is greater than the range of difference between racial groups. So in any event, social construction, that doesn't mean it doesn't have real effects. Remember the Thomas theorem, perhaps? What is believed to be real is real in its consequences. That's rewording the theorem for our purposes, but it's the same concept. So, any event, yeah, I was going to say in the South, there were poor whites, there were sharecroppers, for instance, there might have been some other middle class whites, shopkeepers and so forth, but the majority of the population were Africans held in bondage. The slave trade had ended in I think the 1830s or so. So most there were, I believe, about 400, 500,000 Africans brought to the United States in the 18th century before the slave trade ended, and after that, the children of these slaves simply became slaves. You often in the ancient world, you did not see that happening. Your children would not necessarily be a slave. A slave could marry a non-slave, marry legally. That would not necessarily change the status of the slave, but sometimes they could earn, often they would earn some small amounts of money, and they might be able to save it and buy their own freedom from their I don't want to say master. I'm not sure what the proper term. I'll just say owner. The supervisor that has total control over everything in your life, ouch. So, okay. Well, all right. So I have somewhat strayed from the path of these simple. Let's just go through the slides. There are various theories of racism. Racism is the actively treating someone as if they are, for instance, inferior in some way, simply because they have a particular skin color, or in other cases, it could be they speak a particular language. If we're going to slavery as it existed in the ancient world, for instance. I'll give a formal definition to racism here in a moment, but so I'm going to share my screen. We're going to run through this stuff as quickly as I can. I will try not to get too far off the beam here. Okay. These photographs just illustrate some of the themes we'll be talking about. Here's a African-American soldier returned from the Second World War. Looks like he might have some ribbons showing some distinction for some meritorious conduct of one sort or another. Excuse me, I think this will be better if I move this. So just one moment. I'm going to stop the share a different screen. I'll share this one. And it didn't work. All right, well, we'll go back to where I was. You'll just have to bear with me looking off to my right as I look at the all right. Okay, here is a scene from the Jim Crow era, which I will go into further. You see, this is a pool hall, billiards, four-colored, segregated pool hall. Most public facilities were segregated in the South by law during the Jim Crow era. Civil rights movement was a reaction to the Jim Crow, the inequities of the Jim Crow era, and it was a movement to overturn these laws, and in particular to obtain the right to vote. Technically, the Constitution guaranteed or prohibited the abridgment, denial of voting rights on the basis of racial origin or skin color. But in practice, the states found ways to do that, often by, sorry, I've got an alarm of some sort. Okay, anyway, one of these mechanisms was a literacy test. You might have to interpret something from the state's constitution. You might have, and this was a real thing, you might have to, for instance, know the names of every county clerk, which would be the people who registered individuals for, the voting, provided certified voter registration, the names of every county clerk in Alabama in order to register to vote. There were multiple sorts of obstacles like this placed in the path of African Americans trying to exercise their right to vote, guaranteed under the 14th Amendment, I believe. Or either the 14th or the 15th, I'm not certain which. If you've ever heard somebody at a job, a work site or something, we're talking about grandfathering someone in other words, allowing them to do something that they would not presently be able to do because they'd have to have a specific qualification or certificate, but they're allowed to do it because they've been doing this function for so long. It's called grandfathering. That goes back to this era. That is related to how you might wonder, how did poor, uneducated white sharecroppers get registered to vote in the face of these literacy tests and these tests of having to know every county clerk in Alabama? Well, there was an exception. You didn't have to take this test and pass it if your grandfather had the right to vote. Now, if you were African American in the year 1910, your grandfather was probably a slave and of course could not vote. So it just went on forward from that. So if you could not vote and you had a grandson, they could not vote either. So just connecting the families back to the era when they were held in bondage was enough to prevent them from registering and voting when uneducated, poor whites, sharecroppers were able to do so. Grandfather clauses. You see that a lot. So if you ever encounter that or you find yourself using it, just remember the source. So, okay, so here we have Mexican Americans in Los Angeles waiting at a job hiring hall. Here are some, I believe these are Filipino farm workers, some Vietnamese refugees, and a Black Lives Matter march. It may not have been called Black Lives Matter at this point. I see Trayvon Martin's name at the time. The first time the phrase was used in protest was after Trayvon Martin was killed in Florida by George Zimmer for, I've heard more than one story about what it was that led Zimmer to shoot an unarmed black teenager. But he was later tried on federal civil rights violations. He was acquitted by Florida courts. Florida had a stand your ground law, which meant you did not have to, if you could escape a dangerous situations, you were not required to. You could stay there and defend yourself, take action. In this case, Zimmer murdered Trayvon Martin. Black Lives Matter as a movement kind of coalesced. It's a loose coalition of several groups after the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore in 2015. Freddie Gray was arrested for, right now I don't recall, it'll probably come up in, but he was he was transported to the Baltimore City Jail in a police van. His back was broken when he arrived and he died. So Baltimore erupted into days and days of violent protest, which is not uncommon. Martin Luther King said, rioting is the language of the unheard. Many people wonder, well, why would people just, basically trash their own neighborhood, burn buildings in their own neighborhood? But it's you can reach a point where your rage, your resentment is such, and your view of where you fit in society as a whole, you are just disconnected from the. It's not like it is your world anymore when there are those who can murder at will legally. Or simply harass and abuse and continually treat you as if you are what they are making you, a second, third class citizen. So moving on, I'll get past this. So race and ethnicity are different concepts. Race is this thing that's based upon somewhat upon physical differences, but it's not deeply genetic at all. Um, Ethnicity is more related to one's culture. So, for instance, the old archaic racial categories, Caucasian, for instance. Poles are Caucasian, Germans are Caucasian, but they have different cultures. Germans don't tend to have as much ethnicity in the United States. For instance, Irish. Irish, for instance, Irish Americans, it's changing somewhat, but they had a distinct culture. Poles did as well, particularly in a large city like Chicago, which took in a lot of immigrants. If you go to Chicago, you will see neighborhoods where these street signs and business names are in Polish. I've been to the first wedding I attended. I traveled from southern Missouri to Chicago for a Polish Catholic wedding, and the mass was in Polish. The wedding party, they had polka bands and a lot of drinking, which was pretty astonishing for me coming from a fundamentalist Christian background in southern Missouri, very conservative. You did not dance. You definitely did not drink. It was another world. Then the next wedding, went back to Chicago. My father's other sister got married to an Irish individual. And there was Irish music, dancing on tables, people dancing the traditional Irish dances, and a lot of drinking. It was incredible. I mean, I'd never seen anything like it. I think I was 6. But anyway, but these were distinctly different cultures in Chicago. In the small town of Pierce City, Missouri, about 3,000 people at most ever. Now it's, I think, 1,000 people. In Southwest Missouri, where I'm from, there were 2 Catholic churches, because one was for the Germans and one was for people of Polish descent, because they did not get along. They had some disagreement of, I don't know, but 2,000 or fewer people in this town, and they have 2 Roman Catholic churches. And these differences are cultural. Perhaps there was some political issue with them as well, but okay, ethnicity is associated with culture. Race really is just associated with the geographic regions your ancestors were from. Okay, a specific ethnic group, for instance, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, whatever you want, that is an ethnic group, and they're really just bound by a common language more than anything else. There's not a lot in common between Cubans and Argentinians, really, except the language. Particularly today, if you've been following the election in Florida, you've seen the big split between Cuban Americans, they're the candidate they chose, and many other Hispanics. Now we've seen a lot more variation politically among the Hispanics in the Hispanic vote than had been seen in past elections. It's not a monolithic thing. So although you can call Hispanics an ethnic group, there's really, the much more finer distinctions can be made. Here's a link to the changing state of U.S. ethnicity if you want to see some animated graphs and such. So some definitions. A stereotype is just a oversimplification about how a particular group might believe about what they might believe about something, how they might act, react. They can be positive or negative. A positive one, I'm not going to mention any negative ones, but a positive one, for instance, or what some people would say, Asians are good at math. Okay. Now that is a stereotype. And stereotypes are damaging. They can, even the positive ones. Why could the positive ones be damaging? Well, suppose you are Asian and you're not good at math, because it's not the case that all Asians are better than all of any group at math or any particular skill or any group, any of these things. So if you are that Asian that is not good at math, and everyone in the dominant group, and it's widely believed that you're supposed to be good at math, that is not good for your self-esteem. Prejudice is just having an attitude that assumes some other group, racial or ethnic, is less than you in some way. You are superior to them. Okay, prejudice, that's just a mental attitude. When these attitudes are applied, put into practice, we call that discrimination. That is an action. You are engaged in depriving someone of something, of treating them differently. For instance, you're a police officer who tends to pull over black motorists rather than anyone else. You're a policeman, New York policeman in the stop and frisk era, and you are frisking primarily African American people as part of the war on drugs, for instance. Even though most drug users are white, you are focused on the African Americans. So anyway, so intersectionality is the notion, the fact that you can't look at just race, ethnicity, social class, gender, sexual orientation in isolation. They interact and intersect. And the life chances, meaning that's Max Weber's term for the odds you're going to get what you want out of life in capitalist society. Typically that's economic prosperity. In many societies, at least it's a minimum amount of material comfort. So if you are a gay Hispanic woman, your life is going to be different than in your experiences and how the interactions you have with others on the job and at church and other things. It's going to be different than for a straight Hispanic male. Okay. And you can all these, a gay black male may probably has more in common in their life chances with a gay white male than they would with a straight white upper class male. Let's say the first two, let's say they're middle class or working class. They're going to have more in common, even though there are different races. Okay. All right. You can think of, with the concept of intersectionality, you can think of maybe what's someone called a matrix of oppression, where you have a multi-dimensional way of a set of boxes, categories to put people in, and some are neighbors and some are far apart on the other. But it's more than three-dimensional really in this, as I've described it. So you can't really, it's difficult to conceive of 4 dimensions really. So, but anyway, matrix of oppression. The flip side of that, the matrix of advantage. If you're a member of certain groups, you have privilege. In the United States, that is white privilege. So this definition is not that great. It comes from the open educational resource text that we have. In theory, you could have a different group than a dominant group than Caucasians, white people. It's possible. It has been the case certainly in some cultures, other cultures. So white privilege is, racial privilege would be a better term for that. But when in the United States, we talk about white privilege, which are these advantages you get simply because you're white. For instance, it's maybe easier to get a job. I don't recall who did the research, but I think it was Dalton Conley in the book Being Black, Living Red, I think, Living in the Red. Some research was done, I believe Conley did it. They created resumes for 2 equally qualified individuals, and they were able to provide, and they sent the individuals out on job interviews in this case. And during the course of the interview, the white applicants. They chose a white and a black applicant, or perhaps a pool of them, and sent them to multiple employers. I think that's how that worked. The white applicant revealed that he or she was a convicted felon. The African American applicant was not, no criminal record. The white felons were much more likely to get a call back for a second interview than the African Americans. That is white privilege in, on steroids there. So, okay, these racial advantages are built into the everyday operation of our society and many social systems. This is what's known as institutional racism, or systemic racism is now the term which people are using. Institutional racism, that term was first used by Stokely Carmichael. He was one of the founders of the original Black Panther Party. I believe he's from Oakland, California. So we have the new Black Panther Party, in the United States now. The Black Panthers were very startling to people back in the day. They were focused on community self-defense, and they carried weapons. This was in the 1960s, primarily early 70s, when was their heyday. They had some fairly close alliances with members of the New Left movement, the more radical members, Weather Underground, for instance. And anyway, there's more than one film around about the Black Panther movement. Angela Davis was one of the chief theoreticians of the Black Panther Party. She's still teaching at UC Berkeley, I believe, if not another University of California campus. So, okay. All right, many people are racist in their behavior and in their thinking when they attribute beliefs and actions and predispositions to a person's skin color with no evidence that this is connected. It's just something they have learned, they've been taught. People are not naturally racist. In the early years of the American colonies, you had there were originally, not all Africans were brought here as slaves. There were Africans that had gone into England, for instance, as free people, and chose to come to the colonies by becoming an indentured servant, as many white colonists did. An indentured servant gets passage on a ship to the colony, and they don't have money for it, by making an agreement, a contract with someone they have not met, and that the captain of the ship arranges typically, or another intermediary of some sort. They agree to work for a period of time, typically 7 years, for no wages, simply food and shelter, clothing, from someone in the colony. So they get on the boat, they end up in the colony, and they take what they get. In many cases, their situation might not be that much different than what we later think of as slavery. There were some political, what we know from that period is that whites and Africans, English whites and Africans, worked together in the fields if they were both indentured servants, even after Africans were being brought here as slaves, and not so many, and eventually none, were brought here as indentured servants. People got along quite well. They often had relationships, might want to marry. This was upsetting to the dominant elite of these English colonies. They began to pass, in Virginia, they were the first to pass laws forbidding marriage or sexual relations between people of different races, and creating these barriers. And really, it is claimed by, and I've forgotten let's see, I think I have it here right behind me. If I can lay my hands on it quickly, I will tell you his name. Well, I'll probably take a break and then I'll find it. A book on the history of racism. And he basically says racism was created by the English in North America and the Caribbean. So they had colonies in the Caribbean growing sugar, rice, and so forth. And well, they weren't growing them. The slaves that they owned and shipped here were growing, doing the work. Anyway, it's Dr. Wilson says this was an English import. We have him to thank for it. Not really thank, blame, let's say. But people began to learn it. It became part of the way society operated. It became institutionalized. It became systemic. Now, systemic racism, institutional racism, as I say, it's built into the structure. It comes from just the normal operation of social systems, like the police, for instance. They're a social system, socially structured behavior, and institutional organization. Institution is really just a bunch of rules that binds an organization or group that structures their action. It's so the police are a social institution. They have rules. They have a specific culture, which may vary from area to area, but police officers will all pick up certain beliefs and opinions and approaches to doing their job from other police officers. And often these opinions and predispositions disadvantage certain races over others. For instance, racial profiling. It's not only white police officers that engage in racial profiling. It's not only white police officers that have murdered African American motorists or Hispanic motorists. There's something about police culture that you can, if you're not on guard against it, it can creep in. You can take shortcuts. Fear may, dominate your decision making out on the street, and you may be more prone to use deadly force when it isn't really needed than you might otherwise if you'd been trained somewhat differently. Science used to be used to justify racism or scientific racism. It was it grew out of something called social Darwinism in the 19th century. Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species, the text advocating the idea that humans had descended over time from a common ancestor, from a creature that was a common ancestor for not only us, but for the great apes, for instance. We had not been created just all in a flash, as most holy book, most religious dogma texts would claim, but it was a process that occurred over long periods of time. Herbert Spencer, who was a philosopher and something of a sociologist and inventor and other things, he coined the phrase survival of the fittest to summarize what was happening in Darwinian evolution. That became the basis for social Darwinism, which held that the poor, for instance, were poor because they were genetically inferior. They had evolved that way. They were not the fittest. The most successful, the elite, the English elite that controlled the colonies early on, they literally believed that the poor whites, or the white criminals and prostitutes and others, that they were hurriedly shipping to the New World to, as they put it, manure the new land to make it, to be the manure for the new land. Literally, if you know what manure is, you know what I'm saying. That is how they thought of the poor in England. They thought of Africans that way as well. You know, all they did were they were certain that they were the most advanced being on the world in existence at the time, and they deserved everything they had, all of their wealth and all of their power, because they were genetically superior. So that later led to something called the eugenics movement, which involved, okay, well, if poverty and other criminality, even promiscuity, if there's an evolution, if there's a genetic basis for that, and these things are social problems in a sense, well, we can solve these social problems just by controlling the genes, controlling reproduction of people with these problems. Then the eugenicists advocated sterilization of prostitutes, of the mentally ill, and so forth. If this sounds like something Hitler was up to in the 1930s and 40s in Germany, you're absolutely correct. He believed this as well. You know, although he was trying to purify the Aryan race, he did not. You know, the French, the Russians, they were genetically inferior, and of course, Jews, forget it. Jews were considered a separate race, though, even in the 1890s New York. You could find cartoons where they are drawn as monkeys. The Irish even were considered a separate race, and they were believed to have specific skills that made them useful, or at least Irish women were believed to be naturally, biologically predisposed to be good housekeepers. So if you were a wealthy New York uh, man or woman, you tried to find an Irish woman to clean your house. So that's how far this thinking has taken people to the odd places that are surprising. Um, and it, these scientific justifications, they're still around, but mostly they've been replaced by cultural explanations. Social and cultural factors explain the fact that African Americans have a far lower median income and lower wealth than white Americans. Okay, it's not racism, it's not globalization, it's not persistent and growing inequality that's the root cause, it's culture. So Oscar Lewis wrote a book and popularized the term culture of poverty. Um, Charles Murray was another one who wrote about, well, he's one that continued to advocate a biological basis for racial differences. In his case, one he focused on was intelligence and therefore educational achievement. Um, Obviously, you know, our genes, our brain is this lump of flesh that develops while we are incubating in our mother's womb. Its development is controlled by our genes and by portions of our chromosomes that allow certain genes to switch on and switch off at just the right time. Without those genes, we would not have any intelligence to speak of or any ability to learn new things or create and invent. So there is a biological basis to this, including to our social behavior. The fact that we like to live in groups and be with other people, and we get our identity from how we see other people reacting to us, and our sense of self comes from others, interacting with others. You know, that's just how part of being human, and that's undoubtedly somewhere coded into us biologically. But this biological coding, this predisposition, all it really does is set the range into which you can end up. And it's a very, very, very wide range. You certainly can't go look at something like whether somebody got an A or a C on a standardized test and associate that with genetics. It's been done. Charles Murray did it. So, anyway, I'll go on. More definitions. Racism, just a general definition here. Attitudes, beliefs, and practices that are justifying the claim that this group, people in this category, are superior or inferior to other groups. Within a given racial grouping, you also find another type of discrimination or prejudicial attitude that's become known as colorism. That skin tone within the group can be the basis for categorizing people. There's been a lot of sociological research on that recently. I read one published about a year ago about basketball players. And as you know, because the history of race in America, history is with us all the time. It's not something that is in the past. It is alive today. It is, we're awash in it. So you might have, for instance, African Americans, there's a wide range of skin tones within African American groups, partly from where the ancestors are from. Also, you had people taking the white plantation owners stereotype, raping young slave women. Thomas Jefferson was one. And you would have mixed race children. You also had many African Americans at one point who became Native American in a sense. They married into, had children with Native Americans or vice versa. So there's a lot of overlap genetically between those two groups, and your genes are connected somewhat with your your skin color somewhat. And a lot of that is related to your need for vitamin D. Unless you take a supplement, the only place you get vitamin D is from sunlight. Your skin manufactures it when it's under the influence of the sun. The further north you go, the less sun you get. Further south, towards the equator, more sun. So you can OD on vitamin D. So if you're living near the equator in a very sunny part of the world, you want to block some of that sun. And people evolved natural sunblock in the form of pigmentation that blocks it. Now, that's not very useful to you if you are living in the far north, the frozen north, where you have long, dark winters. You need all the sunlight you can get to create enough vitamin D that you don't suffer from some vitamin D deficiencies, which have been identified in skeletal remains of our, ancestors in an evolutionary sense. So people adapted to where they were living in a way that was reflected in the tone of their skin, the color of their skin, how much melanin was in it, basically. So the research that I read involved analysis. It's called content analysis. They looked at recordings from an NCAA college basketball tournament, and it was recordings of the announcers. And announcers, they chatter and have to come up with things to say about the players while they're waiting for something else to happen when it's not an action. And they analyzed the kind of language they use to discuss different players. And then they took photographs of different players as well as photographs of others and presented these to a panel they assembled, to which and the panel was to kind of put people into groups based on skin tone, a wide palette, not just this darker and not so dark. It was more fine grained. And then they looked to see if there's any correlation between the words that are being used to describe these players and the lightness or darkness of their skin, even within a particular racial group. And they did find statistically significant correlations, which kind of takes us into the realm of something called critical discourse analysis, where you look at how power relations are embedded within language, and the language is very powerful. The language you use can be part of the structures of domination in a given society. So I'll try to post that article if you want to take a look at it and look at some creative and timely research. There is another one that connects to skin tone and health outcomes. There is a definite correlation that is probably mediated by people's interaction with others, because there's research that shows that if you perceive someone is discriminating against you. Now, I say perceive, but again, the Thomas theorem, what you believe to be real has real consequences. You perceive that, there are physical manifestations of that. Increased predisposition towards depression and high blood pressure and other issues that correlate with the degree to which your perceptions. I don't want to say perception means it's not real or it's your imagination. It's something different altogether. This is real. So again, institutional racism or systemic racism is the term we hear more often now. They're the same thing as nearly as I can tell. It's just embedded into the social institutions. One big institution it's embedded in, although it's not, the key thing about institutional racism, it operates even if people are not consciously willing it. Now, in the realm of real estate sales, you could call these practices they engage in institutionalized, but they're aware usually that when they are engaging in redlining or racial steering, that it is a racist practice. So that kind of straddles the boundary. These things we'll talk about in a moment when it comes to inequities in housing and residential segregation. Okay. Types of institutional racism. Racial profiling, we know what that is. Law enforcement, police officers stopping people of color, motorists of color, more often than white motorists. Often, also people of color, once stopped, they're more likely to have their car searched. One of the things that triggers a search often is acting nervous. If the police officer believes you are nervous, they think you're trying to hide something. It's not that you're afraid of them or you're worried. How, you've known people who have not survived these encounters or came out damaged. It's not that you're afraid of that. No, you're nervous. And usually, as a result, these searches come up with nothing. It's been a long time since I've been pulled over, but typically when I would be, you'd see the flashing red lights behind me, my heart rate goes up. I would definitely act nervous. I have been in a situation, and it does happen to, I was much younger. I looked like a hippie, I guess. And I was in a situation where I thought that as this police officer was searching me, and I'm 6'2", I had a Honda Civic. He had me spread eagled against the Honda Civic, and he's kicking my ankles to spread them out. And I was at quite an angle. My legs were shaking, simply trying to hold myself up and not fall on the ground, because he said to me, "You better not make a move to get away from me." And he was alone. The Dallas Tactical Squad. I was alone. I just thought, if I fall, he's going to shoot me in the back and say I was trying to escape. He planted some pills on me. Apparently, he thought I was someone else, because another police officer arrived. They ran my license, announced it was clean, and this first cop that had pulled me over for having a headlight that was out sent me on my way. You know, I'd never, anyway, it could have been much worse. Uh, this was a case where I'd been pulled over before, and he, rather than ask for my license, he simply said, "Get out of the car," and was immediately shoving me with. So it was not, since then, for a long time, I mean, whenever I saw flashing lights, I would just panic. So anyway, and I know that's, you know, not really that bad. In most cases, white privilege got me out of what could have been a bad situation, because I didn't always use good judgment when I was in my 20s. And there were times when my life could have gone a completely different direction, as it has for many African Americans who've been just stopped at the wrong time in the wrong place, and things went wrong. Okay, segregation is physical separation of different racial groups, usually racial groups. Could be ethnic though. Often in terms of where people live, it could be at the workplace. It could be, as in here, we have a pool hall for colored people only. That was the term that was used in the South for a long time. So some people, you know, I know a Jamaican faculty member who doesn't like the term people of color because it's too close to this. And this was considered demeaning, you know, because and now that is a commonly used term. So, you know, people can choose to call themselves whatever they wish, really. I don't have, there shouldn't be any problem with that. We get to define ourselves, in my view. There are things, well, anyway, no need to go there just yet. Okay, redlining is where a bank, for instance, will not give anyone a mortgage in a particular neighborhood. They literally have a red line drawn on a map, and anything within this red line, no mortgage, not gonna. So African Americans often would have to live in rental housing, and in particular, in a segregated community. Wouldn't, even if one had the money and the ability to make house payments, you might not be able to get it. They wouldn't give anyone a loan for a business, for instance, in one of these redlined areas. And racial steering is where a real estate agent is only going to show you houses. For instance, if you are Hispanic or African American, they'll only show you houses in neighborhoods that are predominantly Hispanic or African American. So, by the way, studies have shown that every group, ethnic/racial group, as defined by the Census Bureau, because the Census Bureau does use those categories, prefers a mixed neighborhood. You don't want to be in, homogenous neighborhoods. Every racial group but one. I will let you guess what that one might be that prefers and really wants to not to have anyone other than people that look like them around. But you can probably guess. And I'll give you a hint. They look like me. So, I believe I talked about double consciousness in the section on interaction, social interaction, and socialization. And I also talked about Elijah Anderson when I went through that section. Now, if you're in my social problems class and you're watching this as the substitute for the version with poor video, you didn't have a lecture on socialization and social interaction. I believe that's why that is here. So, in any event, Black Lives Matter movement, I mentioned that coalition formed in 2012. Now that's a slightly different number than I gave you earlier. So I took both of these numbers from several sources. This points up the fact that it is a very loosely organized coalition. 2013, it might have become more of a, well, I'm not sure when the Trayvon Martin shooting in it was used. The phrase was first used at protests over that, and of the acquittal of George Zimmer by a Florida jury. So it's a coalition, mobilizes citizens, organizes protests following police shootings and so forth. I'm sure you're well aware of their work. W.E.B. Du Bois, African-American sociologist, studied under Max Weber, the first African-American to get a doctorate of any sort from Harvard, doctorate in sociology. Probably should be considered the founder of American sociology. He put his faith for Black liberation in what he called the talented 10th. Young people who would seek education and develop themselves and lead by example and work for change. It's been said that you would find the talented 10th now in the Black Lives Matter movement. They are one and the same for some. Anyway, so another one of their activities has been highlighting, pointing out the role, the issue of mass incarceration, the disproportionate imprisonment of Black and Latino males primarily in prison as a result of the war on drugs. When penalties were stiffened, enforcement was stepped up, and as I mentioned, enforcement often involves racial profiling. Anyway, if you've been a felon, and now that's changing, many states felons can vote after they've served their parole, they've been released and then on parole or probation for a while. But quite often, and in many communities, and if you're just out, of course, you cannot vote. You've lost your right to vote. Michelle Alexander, an attorney, wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, basically saying mass incarceration, which was brought on by this war on drugs, a militarized attack on communities of color, has disenfranchised increasing numbers of African Americans who fought long and hard for the right to vote. And under the Jim Crow system of the South, where discrimination was basically legalized, they did not have it. So she's calling mass incarceration / war on drugs the new Jim Crow. Okay, we have a few noteworthy, isn't really the word, but important incidents, police violence against individuals. Eric Garner, July 2014, died after a chokehold used in New York. He was selling single cigarettes. The police officer was not indicted, even though the coroner ruled it homicide. In other words, murder. Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. He was alleged to have stolen some cigars. Darren Wilson shot him 12 times, allegedly after a fight, but many witnesses said he had his hands in the air. So the protests in Ferguson and many thereafter, people would chant or say, hands up, don't shoot. That was the mantra. Freddie Gray, I've already mentioned. Okay, he was arrested for possession of an illegal knife. The Ferguson unrest it went on for quite a while. Ferguson was a community where it was primarily African American. Every police officer was white. They were nearly running the city government on traffic fines and fines for not painting your house often enough, etc., etc. They were found to be in violation of multiple civil rights laws in the way they operated. By they, I mean the city of Ferguson, which is a suburb of St. Louis, by the way. Freddie Gray, April 2015, about a week of National Guard occupied the city for about a week. It was intense. And then most recently, really not most recently, sadly, there have been some incidents since George Floyd, May 25th, 2020. Officer Chauvin restrained him with a chokehold of sorts, pressure from his knee onto George's neck for 8 minutes. He asphyxiated. It led to protests around the world. You can see that I wrote this back in June, really. So many were saying back then, this is going to be the moment when we turn the corner. It's finally going to change. I wish I could say it had, but there has been a lot of talk about defunding police reform of some sort, going from simply things like keeping a database of officers that have been fired for violent violations and complaints by citizens to make it less likely they'll be fired by one force and hired by another, all the way to defunding the police altogether. Just get rid of the police, put it all into social services, mental health care, and response to mental health emergencies, etc. Not really much has happened, period. Okay, Michelle Alexander, I mentioned her. The subtitle was Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. This was published in 2010. After the election of Barack Obama, many people said, well, this shows we're getting past our racist heritage. Race is no longer going to be a thing. We're colorblind now. Well, sociologists and other political scientists, other commentators said, wait a minute, a lot has not changed. If we pretend we're colorblind and race doesn't matter, what we're doing is we're ignoring the problems that continue to exist, like residential segregation, for instance, and inequities in educational systems, to police treatment of African Americans. So some said that colorblindness, the idea that we're colorblind, that's sort of the new racism. It becomes kind of a subtle manifestation of white privilege when you say that, no, I don't see race. I treat everyone the same. But the idea, the fact systemic racism doesn't require people to make a decision to discriminate against someone in a racist manner. It operates that way. So Alexander saw the war on drugs really as part of the strategy to control African Americans in this colorblind era. She traced the history of how problems in African American communities fed political changes at the level of presidency, really. The South used to be known as the Solid South because they would always vote Democratic. Now, the Democrats back then, they were people that ran the Jim Crow system for the most part. They were very conservative. They were opposed to integration, which is the opposite of segregation, by the way. Segregation, separating people. Integrating is mixing the people. They did not want integrated schools. They did not want African Americans at the University of Mississippi. They did not want a variety of things that we now just, seem normal. Interracial marriage was illegal in most southern states, as well as a lot, anyway. But that stranglehold was broken. You notice if you're watching the elections, the South is pretty much Republican now. So what happened? Well, in the late 60s, after the civil rights movement in the mid 60s, and somewhat successful, there were some successes. Passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the period of the Freedom Riders, but then Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. He was on the balcony of his room at the Lorraine Hotel, which is now part of the National Civil Rights Museum. If you're ever in Memphis, I strongly encourage you to go. So, and African American communities erupted with rage after that assassination. Um, it was very widespread. Northern cities, now in southern cities as well. Northern cities were also segregated, but it was different than the segregation that you had in the South in the Jim Crow era. Remember, Jim Crow was legalized segregation. The term is de jure, D-E space J-U-R-E, jure like jury or jurisprudence. That means by law, Latin for by law. In the North, you had the type of segregation there was referred to as de facto, D-E-F-A-C-T-O, meaning it's a fact. You can see it. It's not part of any legal code, but it is developed. Real estate industry and preferences of the dominant group and so forth had led to the creation of that. Some have said C. Vann Woodward, who wrote The Strange Career of Jim Crow, a very good book. I encourage you to read that too. I think it's C. Vann Woodward. I may, just a moment. I do know where that one is. Well, I say that. But that is because it's over here. Just a moment. While I'm here, though, this book, this fellow Richard Rothstein, a economist with the let's see, what group is he with here? Thurgood Marshall Institute, the Economic Policy Institute, was in Houston to talk about this book. It's basically how federal law and state laws have, how racism has been embedded in the operation of the federal government and the legal system as a whole, particularly in the area of housing. There are multiple examples that are worth discussing and mentioning, but I don't think we have time for that. So, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, if you can find it. Here we are, yes, C. Vann Woodward, Strange Career of Jim Crow. It's, well, it's about 200 pages, but it's very good reading. He argues that the structures, the processes of the Jim Crow South were more or less perfected in the North even before the Civil War. There was rampant segregation in the North, and they simply copied some of those practices. It's often not part of the typical narrative that we absorb, but it is the case. I remember the first time I heard, I grew up in Missouri, which had been, they were not they did not secede and become part of the Confederate States of America, but they did permit slavery. There were many German immigrants there who had come there because they weren't necessarily, immigrants often, when they're doing well, they're not going to revolt against the nation that's taken them in. So they were loyal to the Union, but there were others in the state. It was split. It was a border state. There were people who were Southern sympathizers who joined the left and joined the Southern Army, the Confederate Army. Some formed guerrilla bands. The outlaw Jesse James was a member of a group called Quantrill's Guerrillas, which is a brutal bunch of criminals, really, that took advantage of the war to rob, murder, and rape and pillage. So the state was really split. And if you want to see a good, excellent film that deals with that era and is historically accurate in terms of how people actually spoke back then and some of the complexities of it's called Ride with the Devil, and the devil being Quantrill. The film portrays, among other things, the burning of Lawrence, Kansas. Kansas did not allow slavery. And there was a lot of hostility and border raiding between these people, the Southern sympathizers in Missouri and people in Kansas. At one point, they burned Lawrence, Kansas to the ground. Lawrence is where the University of Kansas is located. Murdered most of the adult males and any African Americans they found because they would have been freed slaves. And even in my own family, my grandfather's grandfather was apparently most people in that family were Southern sympathizers. He was not. He left and joined the Union Cavalry. Was captured at a battle, I think, in Arkansas, and was marched to Tyler, Texas, where he spent several years in a Confederate prison camp. And after that, he hated everything about the South, particularly Texas, until the day he died. He went beyond what you might think of as just having anger and resentment over his treatment there. If I read of some things that happened at that prison camp that not necessarily to the prisoners, but just to make some sort of an example or to frighten them. And if he saw any of those things, I certainly understand why. In 1916, after seeing Woodrow Wilson, the president, campaigning in Mississippi, standing in front of the Mississippi State House with the governor and a flag, the state flag, which had these stars and bars of the Confederate States of America, you know what I'm talking about, on it. He went berserk and was threatening to find the president and kill him because he had committed treason by even getting near a Confederate flag. So he was talked down by some authorities. He was reported, but he really had no means of doing it. So, but anyway, he was pretty old at that time. This would have been, a good 50 years after his time in Tyler. And I mean, I could see it in my grandfather, who, whenever I mentioned Texas, his eyes glazed over. He just did not, he was hearing something about the devil, but based on things he'd heard from his grandfather. So anyway, but Missouri was split, and there was slavery there, though. There was not so much plantation agriculture along the Mississippi River in the east. Cotton was grown. Primarily, slaves were like domestic servants or farmhands and so forth. And I was, growing up there, I was unaware of segregation. I was really shocked when I discovered that the very few Black families in town all lived on the same street. I did not understand that. It was not something, but anyway, I was going to say the first really racist talk and worldview I encountered was in Chicago among my father's relatives in the late 60s. But which takes me back to my naivete again about, I knew that, the town I grew up in, diversity is not any word you'd use to describe the makeup of people there. And I always thought that was because this was Ozark area, not suited to much agriculture really. So there never was a large African American community there because there had been very few slaves there. George Washington Carver grew up 10 miles from there. But again, he apparently was adopted or not adopted, he was purchased, sorry. So there's no getting around the fact that there was this kind of relationship by a childless couple, and apparently was, to a certain extent, was treated as if he was their child. He learned to read, which was unusual in that era. It could be illegal to teach a slave to read. Often, in many places, it was. Nevertheless, I thought there just never been a large community, but later I heard about something called sundown towns. Some of you may have heard of this. I found a book, someone who has been studying these sundown towns, the hidden dimension of American racism. You see this sign here. It says, if you can see that, whites only after dark. I've had at least one student who remembers her mother or grandmother talking about this. A sundown town is a place that used to have an African American community, but something bad happened. And for their own safety, they moved somewhere else. And apparently, the town I grew up in could be considered one of those. There was another one in 10 miles away that allegedly had a sign of this sort, only more brutal. Don't people would be, African Americans could come into work, but were expected to be gone from the town as soon as the work was over. So there was a form of segregation that had been established by some brutal action on the part of the white majority in these towns. And they're primarily in the Midwest, not in the South, as you might think. But there have been a number of incidents where an African American community in the South it disappeared by white violence. So, but in this case, this is more a northern thing. So, anyway, Massey and Denton wrote a book, American Apartheid, Segregation and the Making of the Underclass. It was a very influential book. I recommend it too. It's older. Basically, they say really to eliminate racism and creates equity, you have to address residential segregation. That's the root of it, because typically schools are paid for from property taxes. And that connects education, the quality of education, with the quality of your housing. The quality of your housing, if you live in a rental house because racist real estate practices prevent you from getting a loan to purchase a house, your children are going to not maybe get an education that's as good. That's going to have ramifications on their earnings potential in the future, and so forth and so forth. There were regulations passed in the late 60s to investigate and eliminate these sorts of practices I mentioned, like racial steering and redlining and so forth in the real estate industry. But and many of these practices, as I mentioned, were part of the rules that the federal government set up for housing programs established after the Second World War, when there was a shortage. So they were rooting out other federal practices, really, in many ways, that had been institutionalized in the real estate industry. But the federal government was active in attempting to reduce residential segregation, but in the mid-70s, it just stopped. They just stopped their activities. There are sociologists and urban planners and policy analysts that do what are called housing audits, where they will send a couple out with documents showing they have a great credit rating and a good income, and an African American couple, for instance, that is working with them, and send them out to look for a house and see what happens. Do they get shown only houses in segregated areas of the city where everyone, where there are few, if any, members of the dominant white majority, if it's still a majority, living? Or are they shown houses simply based upon their ability to afford the house? Well, they keep finding it's still happening, and it's still happening. And anyway, so an important thing they pointed out, American cities were more integrated in 1890 than in 1970. 1890. So that's the beginning of the Jim Crow era, though, really. The Jim Crow era did not start immediately after the Civil War. It really was, it has been read as, many people read it as a reaction to the populist movement, a political movement that began in the late 1880s and kind of was dead on the vine in 1896, but it was a coalition of poor farmers and sharecroppers, and it was a black-white coalition. Black sharecroppers and white sharecroppers realized economically they were in the same boat. During this period, railroads that you needed to contract with to ship your, whatever you grew to the major markets continually raised their prices. There was generally only one railroad you could ship with. Sharecroppers are perpetually in debt to whoever gives them credit to purchase seed and equipment, whatever they need for planting, that they have to repay at the harvest. And they realized that they could accomplish more together than separately. So they did join together. It was a multiracial, probably really, and it could have been, yeah, in Texas, I think there were Latino farmers as well, which there used to be many of them lost their land as Texas was conquered. I talked about that yesterday, or not yesterday, but in part one of this lecture. And nothing scares the powers that be more than multiracial coalitions in the United States anyway. And they worked to split it, and they managed to do that because sadly for many of these southern farmers and people who were able to inspire enough people they might be a leader of a group, often you didn't have to scratch too far to find the racists there. I think the guy's name was Tom Watson, who had been a leader, and then suddenly he's moving closer to the Klan than to the populist movement, and that really it weakened the movement considerably. And later, when the party dissolved and basically threw their support to the Democratic candidate in 1896, who lost, that was more or less the end of it. Sometimes, if you watch the news, you hear populism being considered it's sort of a bad word in a way. The spread of populism is considered a threat to democracy. Populism, in the sense that it meant in the United States in the late 19th century, was democracy. That was what they were advocating for, increasing the democratic, making the life in the United States more democratic, more egalitarian. As it's used today, it means more like our current president is called a populist. There are no billionaire populists. This means it's ridiculous. So, but language changes, it's inverted. Now in the discourse today, the opposite of this populism that is believed to be, it's an appeal to the people, to take advantage of them in a sense. And typically it's seen as being authoritarian and brutal and harsh and xenophobic, channeling fear of the other into political power. And the opposite of that for them is called pluralism. Now, later you're going to hear me talk about how pluralism was something completely different. So depending upon who you're talking to and what the context is. Populism can mean several things, as can pluralism. But anyway, I digress. More on residential segregation. So just read through this. Some of this is repetition. Edward Bonilla Silva, the book Racism Without Racists. I think it's in his 6th printing now. He wrote about the new racism, which things have been recoded. There's a different language. It's adopted this cultural and market economic explanation or justifications for racial inequality. It is also another attack on the notion that we are a colorblind society. He says it's really just reinforcing racism. Racial practices are kind of, they're hidden with new language. They don't sound like what they are, and government policies that have racializing consequences appear on the surface not to be that. Here's a list of features of the new racism. So take a look at that. Here's just a lot of statistics, which are, you may want to read that. I don't want to. I think we know the general pattern already, but if you need to see, he compiled quite a few numbers. Okay, it's this one though, might well be on the exam. Schools were more segregated in 2001 than they were in 1970. So segregation in the public education has been increasing, primarily in the cities, I think this is referred to. Voter ID laws, mass incarceration, it just goes on. Latinos are another, ethnic group primarily, as I've mentioned. They're bound together by language, really. And there's a lot of diversity, in several dimensions among them. They are the largest so-called minority group in the United States. We're in Houston. We are a majority city. No group has a majority represents a majority of the population. The largest non-white group, let's say, because people used to use this term minority group to mean any non-white group. 57 million citizens of Hispanic origin, estimated in 2015, 17% of the population. Asians are the fastest growing immigrant group, but Latinos are the second fastest growing. Here's the Census Bureau definition. They experience many of the same types of discrimination as African Americans, but not always to as great an extent. Overall, their incomes seem to be, the incomes of Latinos, median household income is a bit higher. So also many in this community are here without documentation. They enter the country illegally, and they can be subject to deportation at almost any time if they're caught at a border patrol checkpoint, which are not, by the way, always at the border. They are on highways that connect border towns with the rest of the country. They're generally, quite often, there will be checkpoints at the border, of course, but then there will be others. I often travel to Marathon, Texas, which is off Highway 90, but I-10 follows the path of Highway 90 up to San Antonio. And we have old US 90 down in Stafford, and I think it cuts through in Sugar Land, and it probably goes through Rosenberg, I believe. I'm not certain on where all it goes. But in San Antonio, it veers off from I-10 and heads to Del Rio, Texas, and then up to the Big Bend area where I go. And so I go through one checkpoint on my way down after I've gone through Del Rio, about 30 miles outside of Del Rio. And then I go through on my way back, I go through another one just before Uvalde, which is probably 80, 90 miles from Del Rio. So then there are others that, if you go south to Big Bend National Park, you'll go through one. If you're unfamiliar with this area of the country I'm talking about, actually, since the border wall was a thing, let me show you a couple of things. Trump promised to build a border wall that Mexico would pay for. Well, we don't really have. I mean, there's bits and pieces and some older walls that, have been refurbished, but it's one of the many promises, which I'm very glad to say he did not fulfill yet. Okay, here we have a photograph of the border, Rio Grande, the Big Bend National Park area, which I have not properly shown you on a map. So you can't be quite sure where it is yet, but here, all right. Right here we see it, west of San Antonio. You see it is where the Rio Grande, coming out of El Paso, makes a bend. It's a big bend, hence the name, Big Bend National Park. It's the least visited U.S. national park, at least it used to be. It's wonderful if you like solitude in the desert. Anyway, back to where I was here. This is on the drive from Presidio along the Rio Grande. Considered the most scenic drive in Texas if you have time. Go to Marfa, Texas, then go south, or rather, go out of Marfa, head for Presidio on the border, cross the river from, what is that other town? Ojinaga, I believe, Ojinaga, Mexico. And then drive southeast along the river towards Big Bend. You go through Terlingua, but this is the Rio Grande here. Oops, sorry. Let's see what detail we got. Not much. So you can, of course, weight it, but this looks pretty rugged. There's no. This is the Mexican side. There's no cities there. There are a few little villages here, farming villages. Not much. Now, once you're in the park, here is the border. This side is Mexico. This side is the United States. There's a parking area. This is Santa Elena Canyon. The Rio Grande has cut this canyon right through here. There's a little trail that goes back into the canyon. So I don't know where you'd put a border wall. I don't know why you would need one here. This appears to be a wall. In my view, that's a pretty good wall. It would be difficult to cut. People have died. There's been a couple people hiked up to the top of this one night, and a couple of guys, and one had to go relieve himself in the evening, left his tent and walked a little bit far and was found dead down at the bottom. So anyway, it's not an easy, not an easy climb. This is a sheer face here. Okay, and then if you follow that trail in, you can see what this border wall looks like. This is Mexico. This is the United States. I don't know. I ask people out there, what are they going to put a fence down the middle? There's people that make money on raft trips up and down the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo del Norte if you're looking at it from this side. anyway, I think they talked Trump out of actually trying to put a wall through here, but of course he said he was going to build it all the way out the entire border. But people, they're when I was first down there at a campground on the river, I mean, there wasn't much of a fence, and occasionally you'd see someone from the other side driving a few cows over to graze in the national park, which is not too cool. But one day when I was down at the canyon, I saw a couple of horses that appeared to be headed back to Mexico. Two of them walking very, deliberately down the road towards the river. So they had found their way probably closer to the canyon, not at the canyon itself. There are several ways to get in there, but there are some farmers. There's a couple little villages across the river, and there's actually now it used to be the case before September 11th. You could just go to an area in the national park, and there would be two or three Mexicans with boats that would take you across the river, and you could go to Boquillas, Mexico. There were a few restaurants and people selling souvenirs, and then you just come back by boat. You give them $1 or $2 for the ride. They eliminated that September 11th, could not cross there, but they created an automated border crossing. If you have a U.S. passport, you just scan it. Right now, I'd be afraid to. The past 4 years, I'd be afraid I'd get over there and somebody would close the border for one reason or another, and I'd have to walk through the desert to get back to Ojinaga and then back. Anyway, but here's something about how there's a lot of old hippies out there. You think of West Texas as being very conservative and redneck, but they aren't all. Here we have Resist, No Wall with the mountains background, Rednecks for Beto, and Will Hurd, who's retired, I believe. He was a progressive Republican from that area, represented that area. So, and here, this is something I was going to show you later. Latinos have had a hard time as Texas has been conquered. Here's something commemorating the Porvenir Massacre, a little known event. I will post that somewhere. There's a film about it that I can't seem to find. I don't think it's ever been fully released, but this was an incident that occurred during the era when the Mexican Revolution was occurring, or just after. It was alleged that some Mexican revolutionaries or bandits, however you chose to characterize them, depending on your political persuasion, had crossed the river and stolen some cattle. And so the Texas Rangers, which back then were really just a brutal mercenary force, could kill with impunity, and that's basically how they carried out the law down there. They went to this city of Porvenir. It was believed they had something to do with these thefts that had been occurring. There's a store also that was nearby. There were a number of Tejanos. Now I said Mexicans, but they were living. This is pretty far. This is 50, 60 miles north of the river. It's not on the border. These were Texans that spoke Spanish, that had been there for many, many years before it was a state or a country or whatever it was. But the group of Texas Rangers went to this community. They rounded up all the men and boys over 12, took them a little ways away, and simply shot all of them, murdered them. Let's see how many people here. Rangers from Company B and Marfa, 15. Then the families decided it would be better to go back at some point. They left. So there's really nothing here but this marker, and getting it put up was very controversial because these families had a lot of land, and the land ended up in the hands of some Anglo ranchers. So the Anglos that run that area, that county, Presidio County, are sensitive about this. But as you can see, Latinos have suffered extrajudicial executions at the hands of Texas law enforcement officials for a long time as well. So, all right, some more information about Latinos. I'm not going to say this is an accurate number. So again, if you're taking this test, it's an open book test, so don't worry about it. I kind of dropped this into the wrong place, really. A film you can stream from the library by James Baldwin. Here's the link. If you have time, you could write a paper about this for extra credit if you like. It's an excellent film, narrated by Samuel Jackson. And it brings Baldwin's work and ideas into the present moment. He was very well known during the 1960s and 70s. He was a prominent writer. One of his books that's still read is called The Fire Next Time, about the African American experience, civil rights. And so there's been a lot of discrimination against immigrants of all sorts in the United States throughout our history. Nativism is sometimes called, but another word is xenophobia, fear of the other. Xeno is the alien. So often, well, we'll get to that in a moment. So here's a few charts showing patterns in Latino immigration, but only up through 2010. I need to get some updated stuff. It can be hard to track these down, and I can get raw data and make my own. Median personal income for different groups. Civil rights movement, I talked about in part one. Here's some more information you can go through if you don't know the history of the civil rights movement. Just some other terms that relate to relations between groups. Genocide is basically wiping out another subordinate group. You can sometimes expel them, force a group out of the country. Segregation, I already mentioned. Pluralism is another way of using the term pluralism, considering it used to be called a mixing pot. Cultures all mixed together to be the same. That's amalgamation, or assimilation, excuse me. Or it can be a combination of assimilation and amalgamation. But salad bowl is a better metaphor because different cultures these days retain their uniqueness. They are not forced to assimilate, to adopt all of the customs, practices, clothing styles of the dominant group. It used to be the case this was expected. It was forced on the Native Americans in a very brutal way. Their children were taken and put in boarding schools run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a federal agency that had control over the Native Americans in the United States to a certain extent. So amalgamation is a minority group and a majority combined to form a new group. This is a sort of a hybridization, hybridity. That's all I have for that. That's enough. Stop the share, post this. Good evening.